A husband and wife took their infant daughter on a quiet trip into the towering redwood forests, but the family never came back. At first, no one thought much of it. People get lost in forests all the time. But when days passed with no word, search teams were sent deep into the woods. They searched for miles. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs tracked every possible trail. But somehow, there was nothing. No car. No bodies. No sign the family had ever been there. For 4 years, the case went cold, becoming nothing more than a tragic local legend whispered among the small towns surrounding the forest. Until one afternoon, a group of mycology students studying fungal growth noticed something strange at the base of an old redwood tree. What they discovered beneath the soil would unravel a horrifying truth that had been hidden just beneath the surface. Before we begin the full story, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is watching from. And if you enjoy real, mysterious, and true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Picture the most peaceful place you've ever been. Sunlight cutting through cathedral trees. The smell of earth and rain and something ancient. The kind of silence that makes you feel small, not in a frightening way, but in a holy way. Now imagine that same silence swallowing a family whole. A husband, a wife, their 6-month-old daughter, and not a single trace left behind. That is exactly what happened in the fall of 2018, when Daniel and Claire Whitmore drove their silver Subaru into the ancient redwood forests of Northern California and never drove back out. For 4 years, the case sat in a cold file at the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office. 4 years of silence. 4 years of a grandmother lighting a candle every single night for a daughter, a son-in-law, and a grandchild she would never hold again. 4 years of search parties slowly giving up. 4 years of the forest keeping its secret. And then one autumn morning in 2022, a group of mycology students from Humboldt State University noticed something growing at the base of a redwood tree roughly 3 miles off the main trail. Something unusual. Something that had no business being that large, that strange, that wrong. What they found beneath the soil of that forest floor would not only close a 4-year investigation, it would open a horror that no one had fully prepared themselves to face. This is the story of what happened in the redwoods. And it is a story that does not have a clean ending. Because evil, real, human evil, rarely does. To understand why this case broke so many hearts, you need to understand who Daniel and Claire Whitmore were. Daniel was 34 years old at the time of his disappearance. He had grown up in Sacramento, the son of a high school science teacher and a nurse. He was, by all accounts, someone who made the world feel safer simply by being in it. He had studied environmental science at UC Davis, gone on to work as an environmental consultant for a mid-sized firm in the Bay Area, and spent his weekends hiking, kayaking, or volunteering for trail maintenance projects in state parks. He was the kind of man who carried a trash bag on hikes just in case, who knew the Latin names of plants and taught them to anyone willing to listen. Claire was 31. She had grown up in Oregon, moved to San Francisco for college, and stayed. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, mostly for nonprofit clients, because she said she liked work that meant something. Her Instagram, later preserved by investigators as part of the case file, was a careful archive of the world as she saw it. Morning coffee on a fire escape, farmers market vegetables arranged like still life paintings, close-up photographs of moss and lichen and forest floss. She had a photographer's eye for small, overlooked beauty. They had met at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2013, married in a small outdoor ceremony in 2016, and welcomed their daughter, Lily Rose Whitmore, in March of 2018. Friends and family described those first months of parenthood as the happiest time of Daniel and Clay's lives. There were photos to prove it. Lily tucked into Daniel's arms like she'd always belonged there. Claire asleep on the couch with Lily on her chest, both of them lit by afternoon sun. A young family at the very beginning of everything. 6 months after Lily was born, Daniel and Claire packed the car for a 3-day trip to the Redwoods. It was a trip they had been planning since before Lily arrived. A gentle introduction to the world they both loved. Easy trails. No technical terrain. Just the quiet and the trees. They had done everything right. They left their full itinerary with Claire's mother, Sandra Okafor, who lived in Portland. They told her which trailheads they planned to park at, which campsites they had reserved, what time they expected to return on the 3rd day. Sandra saved the message. She still has it. On a Friday morning in October of 2018, Daniel and Claire loaded Lily into her car seat, drove north into the trees, and disappeared. The last verified contact from Daniel or Claire Whitmore came at 11:47 a.m. on Saturday, October 13, 2018, the 2nd day of their trip. It was a photograph, not a message, not a phone call, just a single image, automatically backed up to Daniel's cloud account in the seconds before his phone lost cell signal entirely. It showed Daniel and Claire standing together on a wide dirt trail, dappled light falling through the redwood canopy above them, Lily strapped to Daniel's chest in a gray baby carrier. Both of them were smiling. Claire's hair was loose around her shoulders. Daniel had one hand raised slightly, mid-laugh at something. They looked happy. They looked safe. What made that photograph significant to investigators, and deeply unsettling, was something you'd almost miss at first glance. It was not a selfie. The angle was wrong. The framing was too composed, too centered, the kind of shot you only get when someone else is holding the camera, which meant another person had been standing on that trail with them. Another person had lifted Daniel's phone, looked through the screen, and pressed the button. Another person had seen them alive. Investigators spent weeks trying to identify who that person was. They put out appeals in local newspapers, posted on hiker forums, contacted park ranger stations, and eventually, they found him. His name was Peter van der Berg, a Dutch tourist who had been traveling solo through Northern California that October. He was soft-spoken, clearly distressed when investigators contacted him, and immediately cooperative. He told investigators that he had come across the couple on the trail mid-morning. They had chatted briefly. He had admired the baby, commented on the beautiful weather. At their request, he'd taken their photo. Then they had gone their separate ways. But here is the detail that Peter offered that no one had counted on. The detail that would quietly shape the entire investigation. After the photo, Daniel and Claire had continued along the trail. Not back the way they came. Not toward the main campground. They had gone deeper, toward the older section of the forest. He said, toward the part of the park marked on trail maps with a dotted line and a small notation that read, unmaintained. Difficult terrain. Not recommended for casual hikers. Peter had thought nothing of it at the time. They seemed like experienced people. They had a map. They were smiling. That was the last time anyone, aside from whoever buried them, ever saw Daniel and Claire Whitmore alive. Sandra Okafor made the call to authorities on Sunday evening, October 14th. When Daniel and Claire failed to arrive home on schedule and their phones went straight to voicemail. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had raised 3 children largely on her own, had worked as a pediatric nurse for 20 years, had seen enough genuine crises to know the difference between worry and alarm. This was alarm. By Monday morning, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office had a missing persons report filed and had contacted the Park Service. By Monday afternoon, search and rescue teams were moving through the forest. What they encountered was something that humbles even the most experienced wilderness rescuers. Northern California's old-growth redwood forests are among the most complex and disorienting environments on Earth. The canopy is so thick that GPS signals become unreliable. The undergrowth, ferns, sorrel, fallen timber, is dense enough that a person could be lying 10 feet off the trail and be invisible from the path. The ravines that cut through the forest are sudden and steep, dropping away without warning. Sound behaves strangely under old-growth canopy, absorbed by the bark and the moss and the saturated soil. You can shout and your voice travels nowhere. Search dogs were brought in. They picked up scent from items taken from the couple's car, a jacket of Claire's, one of Lily's blankets, and they followed it. They followed it along the main trail, past the point where Peter had photographed the family, and then further east, deeper into the old forest. And then the scent simply ended. Not at a ravine, not at a campfire site, not near any landmark. The scent ended in the middle of an unmarked section of forest, and the dog circled and could not pick it up again. Experienced handlers found this deeply strange. Scent trails don't just stop. They fade, they weaken, they branch, but they don't simply cease to exist. The handlers noted it in their reports and said nothing publicly. Aerial support was deployed, but the redwood canopy defeated it. Thermal imaging, used effectively in other wilderness searches, was useless under 300 feet of living wood. The helicopters flew their grids and saw nothing but green. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds over the first 2 weeks. Former military, experienced hikers, local community members. They walked shoulder to shoulder through sections of forest, calling names, looking for anything. A shoe, a piece of clothing, a dropped water bottle. They found nothing. Not a single piece of the Whitmore family. Not a button, not a diaper bag strap, not a strand of hair, was found in those first weeks. In the history of the search, a veteran tracker named Roy Ellison would later tell a journalist, "I've worked search and rescue for 22 years. I've never worked a case where we found nothing. Not one thing. That's not how the wilderness works. People leave traces. These people left none." 3 weeks after the search began, it was officially scaled back. 2 months later, it was suspended. The Whitmore family was listed as missing, presumed dead. The how and the why remained unknown. Sandra Okafor drove home to Portland, sat in the chair by her living room window, and began lighting a candle every night. Grief is not a single event. It is an ongoing condition that reshapes itself around the absence at its center, the way a river reshapes a riverbed, slowly, continuously, without a single dramatic moment you could point to and say, that is when everything changed. For Sandra, the years after her daughter's disappearance were an exercise in refusing to accept the silence that the world kept offering her. She called the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office every 3 months. She hired a private investigator for 2 years, a former detective named Marcus Webb who specialized in cold cases, and paid him out of her retirement savings. She started a website. She appeared on a local news segment, and then a regional news segment, and then a true crime podcast that had 500,000 listeners. She answered every email, every message, every reach out from amateur sleuths who thought they had a lead. Most of them were nothing. Some of them were cruel. She answered them all anyway. Marcus Webb did what investigators do in cold cases. He went back to the beginning and looked for the thing that had been missed. He re-interviewed Peter Van der Berg. He drove to the forest and walked the trail where the last photo had been taken. He requested the original case files and read every page. 2 things in those files had nagged at the original investigators and had never been fully resolved. The first was the scent trail ending so abruptly, the search dog's uncharacteristic failure. The second was a detail buried in the Park Service's supplemental reports. Around the time of the Whitmore family's disappearance, park rangers had documented evidence of illegal activity in the restricted backcountry sections of the forest. Specifically, burl poaching. Redwood burls, the massive, gnarled growths that form on old-growth redwood trunks, are extraordinarily valuable. They contain extraordinary wood grain, used by furniture makers and artists, and can sell for tens of thousands of dollars per piece. Their removal is both illegal and environmentally devastating. Cutting a burl from a living redwood can kill the tree. But the prices commanded by poachers had, over the years, drawn increasingly organized criminal operations into protected forests. Operations that moved quietly, worked at night, and did not welcome witnesses. Marcus Webb took this thread and pulled on it. He identified 2 men who had been prosecuted for burl poaching in the same forest system, in adjacent counties, in the year prior to the Whitmore's disappearance. Neither man had an alibi for the weekend in question. Neither man could be definitively placed at the scene, and neither man could be charged with anything related to the missing family. The thread led nowhere. The case stayed cold. The forest stayed silent. And then, 4 years after Daniel and Claire Whitmore walked into the Redwoods with their baby daughter, the forest finally made a mistake. Dr. Yoel Ostroff was not looking for a missing family. She was looking for Ganoderma tsugi. Yoel was 32, a mycology PhD candidate at Humboldt State, in her third year of fieldwork studying the distribution patterns of wood decay fungi in old-growth redwood ecosystems. Her work was quiet and methodical and deeply unglamorous. She spent most of her days kneeling in damp soil, photographing mushrooms, collecting samples in sterile tubes, cataloging her findings in a database that maybe 40 people in the world would ever read. She loved it. She had the particular contentment of someone doing exactly the work they were built to do. On the morning of September 9, 2022, Yoel and 2 graduate assistants, a man named Caleb and a woman named Rin, were 3 miles into the backcountry, following a transect line they had laid the previous spring. They had been at this section of forest before. They knew the trees. They knew the usual growth patterns, which is why the bloom at the base of tree number 47 stopped Yoel cold. It was not the species she was expecting. It was not any species she recognized immediately, which, given her expertise, was itself unusual. The growth was massive, sprawling outward from the base of the tree in a rough circle nearly 2 meters across. It was a pale yellow gold at its outer edges, shifting to cream and then to a disturbing, almost oily dark brown toward the center. The fruiting bodies were dense and layered, some of them reaching 6 or 7 inches in height, with a texture that Rin later described as like wet bread that's been left out too long. But it was the smell that stopped them all in their tracks. Fungal growth has a smell, earthy, rich, sometimes sweet, sometimes sharp. This was none of those things. This was the smell of something deeply, undeniably wrong. Something biological and decaying on a large scale. Yoel had smelled animal carcasses in the field before. Deer, elk, once a black bear. This was that smell, but larger, older, as if whatever was decomposing beneath the soil had been doing so for a very long time. Something died here, Caleb said. Something big, Yoel replied. She photographed the bloom from every angle, collected samples from 3 separate points, recorded their GPS coordinates, and called the park ranger station on her satellite communicator. She told them she believed there was a large animal carcass beneath the soil at her location, and that it had produced an unusual fungal bloom worth documenting. She asked if rangers could investigate. What she did not yet know, what none of them yet knew, was that there was no animal carcass beneath the soil. 2 park rangers arrived at Yoel's location by early afternoon. They came prepared for what they expected to find: a decomposing deer or elk, perhaps caught in a root system, a common enough occurrence that sometimes produced unusual fungal blooms in the wet seasons. They brought shovels. They brought gloves. They were not prepared for what they found. They began digging carefully, working around the fungal growth, following the smell downward. At roughly 1 foot of depth, the soil was dark and saturated in a way that suggested prolonged decomposition from above. At 2 feet, the smell was strong enough that both rangers paused and pulled their collars over their noses. At just under 3 feet, the shovel struck something solid. Not a root, not a stone, something that gave slightly under the pressure, something with flex to it, something man-made. The rangers stopped digging with shovels and switched to their hands, brushing the soil away carefully. What emerged was the edge of a heavy black plastic torp, the industrial kind used at construction sites or for ground cover. It had been folded over multiple times and secured with what appeared to be zip ties. It was old, degraded by 4 years of soil moisture and microbial activity, but it held its shape. It had been placed deliberately. Ranger Patricia Hollis later told investigators that she knew, in the moment she saw that torp, that she was not looking at an animal. She knew it the way you sometimes know things you wish you didn't. Not because of specific evidence, but because something in the oldest part of your brain is reading the scene and forming the conclusion before your conscious mind catches up. She told her colleague to stop. She told him to step back. She radioed the station and said 4 words: "We need homicide investigators." Then she sat down on a log 20 feet from the tree, put her head in her hands, and waited. The Humboldt County Sheriff's Office dispatched a homicide investigation team to the site. By the time they arrived, it was late afternoon and the forest light was beginning to fail. They set up portable lights and established a perimeter. They worked through the early evening and into the night. What was found inside the torp, what had been buried with such careful, deliberate thoroughness 3 feet beneath the forest floor, were 3 sets of human remains. The decomposition was advanced, as would be expected after 4 years in moist, biologically active soil. Forensic investigators documented the position and arrangement of each set before anything was disturbed. Their findings would be described, in the official case report, as evidence of an intentional burial. All 3 individuals had been placed with some degree of care. The torp had been folded around them together, rather than separately. They were arranged close to one another. Whoever had done this had placed them as a family. Whether that detail was meant as a mercy or as a message, no one could say. The preliminary forensic work took 3 days. On the 4th day, the Humboldt County Medical Examiner's Office released a statement confirming that the remains belonged to 2 adults and 1 infant, consistent in age and physical description with Daniel Whitmore, Claire Whitmore, and Lily Rose Whitmore, missing since October 2018. Sandra Okafor was notified by phone. She was alone in her house in Portland when she received the call. She listened to everything the detective said. She thanked him. She hung up. And then she walked to the window where she had been lighting her candle every night for 4 years, and she stood there for a very long time. The cause and manner of death were determined after further forensic analysis. The official findings were not released to the public in complete detail, as the investigation remained open. But investigators confirmed to Sandra, in private, that the evidence was consistent with homicide. The family had not fallen into a ravine. They had not gotten lost. They had not died of exposure. Someone had killed them, and someone had buried them in one of the most remote, least visited sections of an ancient forest, under 3 feet of soil, wrapped in black plastic, at the base of a tree that would not be examined closely for 4 years. Someone had almost gotten away with it. The reopened investigation brought new resources and new urgency. What had been, for 4 years, a missing persons case that most people had quietly assumed was a tragic accident became one of the most active homicide investigations in the county's recent history. Investigators returned to the original evidence with fresh eyes and modern forensic tools. The burial site was exhaustively documented and processed. Soil samples were taken at multiple depths to establish a timeline of decomposition and burial. The torp itself, or what remained of it, was analyzed for fingerprints, trace materials, fibers, and any manufacturing marks that might help identify its origin. The results were partial but meaningful. The torp was identified as a commercial-grade product sold at multiple large hardware retailers throughout Northern California. On one interior fold, degraded but partially legible, forensic technicians recovered what appeared to be a partial boot tread impression, left when someone had stood on the folded material before placing it in the ground. The tread pattern was matched to a size 11 work boot of a specific brand sold widely in the region. It was not enough to identify a suspect, but it was a direction. Investigators also returned to the original thread that Marcus Webb had pulled years earlier. The bell poaching operations documented in the restricted backcountry around the time of the family's disappearance. With a homicide investigation now officially active, they had new legal tools available to them. They obtained warrants, made new requests, and began making formal inquiries of individuals who had previously been spoken to only informally. Two names kept appearing at the edges of the investigation. Both were connected to poaching activity in the region. Both had prior records for crimes that involved physical violence. Neither had been charged in relation to the Whitmore disappearance. Both were now being looked at much more closely. But here is where the story runs into the wall that so many true crime stories run into. The wall that the justice system builds around the difference between knowing and proving. Investigators believed, with significant confidence, that they understood the basic shape of what had happened to the Whitmore family. A young couple with a baby, exploring a remote section of forest, came upon men who were illegally harvesting redwood burls from protected trees. They saw something. Well, they were seen. And the men, whoever they were, made a decision that no rational, decent human being would make, but that people in the grip of panic and self-interest and moral collapse sometimes do. The family was killed. They were buried. The operation was cleaned up. And for 4 years, it worked. What investigators could not establish, at least not yet, was a direct evidentiary link between any specific individual and the burial site. The tread impression was too degraded for a definitive match. No other physical evidence at the scene could be definitively attributed to a suspect. No witness had seen anyone in that area of the forest in October 2018. The investigation remained active. Charges had not been filed as of the most recent public reporting. There is something almost unbearable about the way this story ends, or rather, the way it doesn't end. Because there is no arrest scene here. There is no courtroom. There is no moment where a door closes and the world becomes, however briefly, fair. There is only a grandmother in Portland, who spent 4 years fighting for the truth and finally received the cruelest possible version of it. There is only a family that came to the forest in October and a forest that swallowed them. There is only the image of a young couple on a sun-dappled trail, their baby between them, both of them caught mid-laugh and the last photograph anyone would ever take of them. And there is the tree. Redwood number 47 on Dr. Yoel Ostrov's transect line. A tree that was alive before the United States existed, that had stood in that forest through every earthquake and flood and drought of the last 800 years, and that had, for 4 years, fed a strange and brilliant fungal bloom on the decomposition of 3 human beings buried at its roots. It is tempting to find meaning in that, to say that the forest revealed the truth, that nature conspired to bring the killers to light, that the ancient trees could not be made into accomplices forever. And perhaps that is not entirely wrong, because it was the fungus, the organism that exists for the sole purpose of breaking down what has died, of cycling matter back into living soil, that ultimately told investigators where to dig. Yoel Ostrov has thought about this a great deal. She was asked in a later interview whether she found it disturbing, whether knowing what she'd found changed the way she felt about her work in that forest. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've thought about whether I wish I hadn't been on that transect line, whether it would have been easier not to find them. But then I think about the mother, and I know the answer. The truth was already there. It had been there for 4 years. What we did was just stop pretending it wasn't." Sandra Okafor has said, in the years since the discovery, that the confirmation of her daughter's death gave her something she had not expected. Not peace, exactly, but a different kind of grief. The searching grief, she said, is the worst kind. The grief that does not know where its object is. The grief that cannot visit a grave. Having a place, even a place in a forest, even a place you cannot easily reach, changed something. It allowed her to stop holding her breath. She had Daniel, Claire, and Lily's remains returned and buried in a small cemetery outside Portland. She chose a plot under a large cedar tree, because it seemed right. She visits every week. The Whitmore family case remains open. No arrests have been made. No charges have been filed. The individuals at the periphery of investigators' attention continue to live their lives, somewhere, out in the world, knowing what they know. That is the hardest part of this story to carry, because we are conditioned, by every story we've ever heard, to expect a resolution. We expect the evidence to build, the suspect to crack, the jury to deliver, the gavel to fall. We expect justice to be, however slowly and imperfectly, delivered. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes a family goes into a forest and the people responsible for what happened to them go home to dinner, and a grandmother in Portland sits alone by a window, and the case file stays active in a county office, and the world keeps turning. This is not a story about justice. Not yet, anyway. It is a story about Daniel Whitmore, who carried a trash bag on hikes. About Claire Whitmore, who photographed moss and lichen because she thought the small things deserved to be seen. About Lily Rose Whitmore, who was 6 months old and had never done anything to anyone and whose entire life was the length of a hike in an ancient forest on a beautiful October day. It is a story about a grandmother who refused to let the silence win, who called and pushed and hired and paid and waited and called again, and who, for years later, was handed the terrible answer she had always known was coming. It is a story about a fungus that fed on decay and, in doing so, exposed the thing buried beneath it. About the strange and dark irony of the organism that lives off death being the one that brought the truth to light. And it is a story with a question still waiting at its center. A question that the forest cannot answer, that the soil cannot answer, that the ancient trees standing in their silence cannot answer. Who did this? If you have any information related to the disappearance and death of Daniel, Claire, and Lily Rose Whitmore, if you were in the Redwood National and State Parks area in October of 2018 and saw or heard anything unusual, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office continues to accept tips. The family deserves the full truth. Sandra Okafor deserves to see justice. The Redwoods are still out there. Still standing, still keeping whatever other secrets have been buried at their roots. Go carefully in ancient places, and if you see something that doesn't belong, something growing where it shouldn't, something buried where it was never meant to be found, look twice, because the forest does not always keep its secrets forever. What do you think happened to this family? Do you believe someone in the forest was responsible, or could there be another explanation? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy true mystery stories like this, make sure you subscribe for more unbelievable cases.